Welcome to HOA Denied Access, the channel where we expose the hidden battles and fight for justice when doors are slammed in your face. Subscribe now and stay with us until the end, because every second counts in these stories. It was a bright, calm morning, the kind that made the world seem still and peaceful. The sun glistened through the leaves of the old oak trees lining the streets, casting soft shadows on the perfectly manicured lawns of the suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped gently from the branches, and the hum of a distant lawnmower blended with the occasional sound of a car passing by. In this quiet, picturesque corner of the world, everything seemed just as it should be, serene, calm, and predictable. But today, the ordinary would slip into chaos. What began as just another peaceful day would soon become a day we would never forget. Maya Angelou, a young woman bound to her wheelchair, was enjoying the simplicity of her morning routine. Her days, though often quiet, were filled with moments of quiet triumphs and small victories, like her ability to navigate her neighborhood despite her disability. She pushed the wheels of her chair slowly, carefully, down the familiar path towards the local park. Each movement, each turn of the wheel, was a testament to her strength. It wasn't just about getting from one place to another, it was about asserting her independence, showing the world that she could still live, still move, still be part of it. She had become accustomed to the stares, the whispers, the occasional pitying glance from strangers, but today, nothing could have prepared her for what was to come. As Maya passed by the neat, white fences that bordered the pristine homes, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't need to look back to know who it was. It was Karen, as usual, making her presence known. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for years, and in that time, she had earned a reputation for her demanding nature and condescending attitude toward anyone she deemed beneath her. Privilege radiated from her, an unspoken air of superiority that made others step aside when she spoke, when she walked, when she simply appeared. To her, the rules didn't apply. Maya felt the weight of Karen's gaze on her back, the familiar sense of discomfort creeping into her thoughts. Karen's footsteps grew louder, faster, until she was beside her, walking with the same forced smile she always wore. "Must be nice to be so dependent, huh?" Karen sneered, her voice dripping with mockery. The words were out before Maya had time to respond, and Maya stiffened, her fingers tightening around the wheels of her chair. It was moments like these that made her feel smaller, more vulnerable, but she held her head high. She had learned to ignore Karen's cruel words over the years, but today, something was different. Something in the air felt off. Karen's voice, now tinged with irritation, broke through the silence once again. "You really should be more careful. You wouldn't want to end up in a way, would you?" The edge in her voice was unmistakable. Maya felt a pang of unease ripple through her, but she tried to push forward, to keep moving, to maintain the dignity she had so fiercely fought for. The park was just ahead, a small haven, but she wasn't going to make it there without feeling the weight of Karen's presence looming over her. In the space of a few moments, the quiet, peaceful morning she had enjoyed so much turned into something she could not ignore. Karen had crossed a line, one that would push things past the point of no return. Maya wouldn't just be a passive bystander today. This time, she would be forced to confront something much darker, something that could no longer be swept under the rug. Maya Angelou had never considered herself different from anyone else. She wasn't defined by her disability. In fact, for much of her life, she had pushed against the notion that being in a wheelchair somehow made her any less capable of leading a full, meaningful life. From the very beginning, her life had been marked by challenge and adversity, but also by an unwavering determination to prove that her body might be limited, but her spirit never would be. Maya was born to a modest family in a small town. Her parents had always been loving and supportive, though life had not been easy for them. Her mother, a hard-working woman, had instilled in Maya the values of resilience and independence from an early age. When Maya was only 4 years old, she was involved in a tragic car accident that left her with permanent spinal cord injuries. The doctors said she might never walk again. For most, That would have been a death sentence to their dreams. But for Maya, it was merely a new beginning, a challenge to overcome. Growing up, Maya was determined not to let her disability define her. She pushed herself harder than most, and though it was exhausting and painful, she always made sure to carry herself with dignity. At school, she never allowed the pitying looks of her classmates to affect her. She joined clubs, participated in class discussions, and excelled in her studies. She refused to be seen as the girl in the wheelchair, the girl who needed help, but as Maya, the same Maya who loved to read, write, and play chess. And most importantly, she made sure to live as much of a normal life as possible. But the world didn't always see her that way. She often faced whispers behind her back, the kind of whispers that made her feel like an outsider, even in places where she should have felt safe. There were always the kids who didn't know how to treat her, the ones who saw her disability and allowed it to shape how they acted around her. But Maya had learned early on that it was not their ignorance that would hurt her, it was her inability to rise above it. The greatest support in her life had always come from her family, especially her father, who was her rock. He never once saw her as limited by her wheelchair. He taught her how to take care of herself, how to navigate the world on her terms. His words, always wise and full of love, had stuck with her. You are capable of anything, Maya. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But while Maya had fought to establish her independence, there were days when the struggle became too much. The exhaustion from the constant fight to prove herself, to convince people that she was just like everyone else, would weigh heavily on her. Her physical limitations were one thing, but the emotional burden of societal judgment was something else entirely. On days when the world seemed to close in around her, Maya would retreat to her quiet sanctuary, her favorite spot in the park. There, amidst the greenery and the calmness of the world, she could find peace, even if only for a little while. It was a small escape from the pressures of living in a world that still wasn't ready to accept her as she was. It was there, alone with her thoughts, that she could forget the expectations others placed on her and simply be herself. And it was in that very park, on a morning that seemed so ordinary, that everything would change. The world she had worked so hard to navigate would soon be disrupted by someone who didn't see her as a person at all, someone who saw her only as an inconvenience, a reminder of something they didn't want to face. Karen, on the other hand, had never been forced to prove anything to anyone. From the moment she was born, the world had catered to her every whim. Raised in a privileged household, Karen had never known what it was like to face hardship or struggle. Her father had been a successful businessman, her mother a prominent figure in the community, and everything she wanted had always been just a phone call away. She had always been the center of attention, the one who got what she wanted when she wanted it. Karen had spent her entire life moving through the world with a sense of entitlement that bordered on arrogance. Her views on those less fortunate were clear. She saw them as beneath her, and the disabled even more so. To her, people like Maya Angelou were nothing more than an inconvenience, a reminder of what she refused to acknowledge, that some people could be vulnerable, that the world wasn't always fair, and that not everyone had the luxury of taking life for granted. Her interactions with neighbors were often a display of superiority, always with a snide remark or a passive-aggressive comment. If Karen had to do something she deemed beneath her, she did it grudgingly, making sure everyone knew it was a favor. She had never been told no in her life, and the notion that anyone might challenge her authority, whether it was in her personal life or in the community, was something she simply couldn't accept. It was this mindset that made her treatment of others, especially those with disabilities, so deeply troubling. Her view of the world was black and white. Those who could contribute were worth her time, and those who couldn't were not. She saw no value in people like Maya Angelou, who in her eyes had no right to take up space in a world that she believed should revolve around her. And so, when Maya crossed her path that morning, Karen felt a momentary surge of irritation, which quickly grew into something more dangerous: contempt. To Karen, Maya Angelou was a nuisance, a reminder of her own feelings of discomfort about people who were not like her. She couldn't stand to see someone like Maya, someone who had no place in Karen's perfect world, intrude upon her space. The idea of teaching Maya a lesson was tempting. After all, Karen didn't believe she should have to coexist with someone who didn't fit into her vision of the world. The neighborhood setting was, on the surface, the ideal suburban community. Tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and manicured lawns. It was a place where people valued peace and quiet, and where every home seemed like it belonged to a family that had it all together. But beneath the idyllic exterior, there was an undercurrent of tension, a tension that arose from the unspoken rules of privilege and class that permeated the community. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where gossip was currency, and where those who didn't quite fit in were often overlooked or dismissed. People went about their business, keeping their heads down, staying out of trouble, and rarely questioning the status quo. To the casual observer, it was perfect, but for Maya Angelou, a disabled, young woman who had fought for every inch of her independence, it was a world that didn't truly accept her. And for Karen, it was the perfect environment for someone like her to thrive, a place where she could be in control, where her word was law, and where people like Maya would never challenge her. Little did either woman know that their worlds were about to collide in a way that would shatter the illusion of peace that the neighborhood had so carefully cultivated. The calm, predictable life of this suburban enclave was about to be disrupted, and it would never be the same again. The tension in the air was palpable as Maya Angelou approached the park, her mind occupied with the simple task of getting some fresh air and soaking in the peace that the park always provided. She had spent countless hours there, either reading or simply reflecting on her life. It was her sanctuary, her place of solace. But today was different. Today, the serenity of the park would be shattered, and the quiet morning would forever be marked by an act of cruelty that would leave a scar in both her life and the community. As Maya navigated her wheelchair towards the park entrance, the familiar sound of Karen's footsteps echoed behind her. Maya had known Karen for years now, and while they had never really spoken, she could always feel her eyes on her. It was the kind of gaze that made Maya feel like she was somehow less, like she didn't belong in Karen's perfect world. As Maya moved forward, she felt the growing presence of Karen closing in behind her, and she tensed, her grip tightening on the wheels of her chair. Then, the inevitable happened. Karen stepped into Maya's path, blocking her from moving forward. At first, Maya tried to steer around her, thinking that Karen was just going to pass by, as she had done many times before. But this time, Karen didn't budge. Instead, she planted herself firmly in front of Maya, her stance stiff with authority. "Do you really think you should be out here taking up space?" Karen asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "Maybe you should be more careful, stay out of everyone's way." Maya's heart raced, her chest tightening with frustration. She had heard these kinds of comments before, but they had never felt so forceful. She had learned over the years to ignore the hurtful things people said, to rise above the judgment. But something in Karen's voice, something in the coldness of her words, made her feel small, smaller than she had ever felt. "Karen," Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I'm just trying to enjoy my day. There's no need to be rude." Karen's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't kind. It was a smile that only served to highlight her contempt. "Rude," she repeated, her voice mocking. "You're the one who's rude, taking up so much space. You should just stay at home where you belong." Maya felt her face flush with heat. How dare she? How dare Karen make her feel like she was less than human, as if she didn't deserve to live her life the way anyone else would? The words stung, but Maya refused to let them break her. She would not let Karen get under her skin, not today. But Karen wasn't done. She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at Maya. Without warning, she pushed Maya's wheelchair backwards, shoving her with enough force to make Maya lose her balance. In that instant, everything seemed to stop. The world around her faded into a blur as she felt the cold shock of the wheelchair tipping back. Maya tried to grasp the wheels, but it was too late. She was sent sprawling to the ground. For a moment, the world was silent. Maya lay there, stunned, her mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, and for a moment, she thought she might be dreaming. But when the sharp pain shot through her body, she knew it wasn't a dream. She had been knocked to the ground by Karen, pushed out of her wheelchair, treated like she was nothing. She could feel the humiliation rising in her chest, the anger and hurt mixing in her veins. How could anyone, let alone someone from her own community, treat her this way? Maya struggled to push herself up, the weight of the situation sinking in. She was no longer just a person with a disability. She was a target, a victim of cruelty, and it was not going to go unchallenged. From the corner of her eye, she saw the faces of a few onlookers. Some seemed to be frozen in shock, while others quickly turned away, unwilling to get involved. Karen, however, stood there with a smug smile on her face. She didn't even offer a hand to help Maya up. Instead, she crossed her arms and looked down at her, as if expecting Maya to somehow accept this as her place in the world. "You really should be more careful, Maya," Karen said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm just trying to teach you a lesson. Maybe next time, you'll know your place." Maya felt the blood rush to her face, a mixture of shame, anger, and disbelief coursing through her. But as she lay there, struggling to get back up, she realized something. This wasn't just about her. This was about a much bigger fight, one that she couldn't let go unnoticed. With the last bit of strength she had left, Maya pushed herself to her feet, using the nearby bench to steady herself. Her legs shook, but she stood tall, refusing to let Karen see her break. She locked eyes with her, and for a brief moment, it was as if the world around them disappeared. It was just Maya and Karen, standing in the middle of the park, two people on opposite sides of a battle that was about to unfold. Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You've made a mistake," she said, her voice steady but cold. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Karen's smile faltered, and for the first time, she seemed to hesitate. The air between them grew thick with the weight of what had just happened. And Maya knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The incident marked the turning point, the moment when Maya realized that her fight for dignity, her fight for respect, was no longer just a personal battle. It was one that needed to be fought for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. And as Karen turned away, smug and satisfied with her actions, Maya knew that this would be the fight of her life. The minutes following Maya's fall were a blur, as she slowly regained her composure and stood upright. Her body trembled not just from the physical shock of being knocked to the ground, but from the emotional weight of what had just transpired. She had been humiliated, treated like an object rather than a person. But most of all, she felt betrayed. Betrayed by Karen, by the community, by the very idea that people could act so cruelly, so carelessly, without any thought of the consequences. Standing in the middle of the park, Maya couldn't help but glance around at the faces of the people who had witnessed the incident. Some were still frozen in shock, their eyes wide, unsure of how to react. Others, who had once smiled at her in passing, quickly turned away, avoiding eye contact, as if pretending nothing had happened would make it all go away. The silence that followed the confrontation was deafening, and Maya felt the sting of isolation more acutely than ever. She wasn't alone, though. Her family had been watching from a distance, having arrived at the park just in time to see the tail end of the exchange. Maya's father, Charles Angelou, was the first to rush to her side. He had always been her protector, the one who had taught her how to navigate the world with grace and dignity despite the challenges she faced. Seeing him now, rushing toward her, his face filled with concern, made Maya feel a strange sense of comfort. He had always been the strong, silent type, a man whose presence spoke louder than words ever could. But today, she could see the anger in his eyes, the protective instinct of a father who would never allow his daughter to be treated with such disrespect. "Maya," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder, "are you okay?" For a moment, Maya couldn't speak. The words were stuck in her throat, tangled in the confusion and hurt she felt. How could she explain what had just happened? How could she make him understand the depth of what Karen had done? But before she could answer, her mother, Olivia Angelou, arrived, her face tight with worry. "What happened, sweetie?" Olivia asked gently, her arms instinctively reaching out to pull her daughter into a warm embrace. "Tell us everything." In the safety of her parents' arms, Maya felt the floodgates of her emotions burst open. The tears came suddenly, unexpectedly, as if they had been waiting to escape all along. She cried not only for herself, but for the years of judgment, for the constant battle to prove her worth in a world that often didn't care to see her as more than her disability. She cried for the injustice of the moment, for the fact that someone could treat her so callously in public without a second thought. She cried because, despite everything, she still couldn't fully understand why Karen had done it, why people like her existed. Her parents stood there, holding her tightly, offering what little comfort they could in the face of such an overwhelming moment. But as Maya composed herself, wiping away the tears, she realized that the situation wasn't over. Far from it. In fact, it had only just begun. "I'm going to make this right," Maya said, her voice thick with emotion but resolute. "I'm not going to let her get away with this. No one gets to treat me like this, not in front of everyone, not ever again." Charles nodded, though his expression remained pained. "You've always been strong, Maya," he said quietly. "But remember, sometimes the fight for justice is harder than we expect. You can't do this alone." Olivia added, "We're with you, sweetheart, every step of the way." As Maya looked up at the faces of her parents, the support they offered filled her with strength. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about standing up for herself, for every person who had ever been mistreated, for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. She couldn't let this moment pass by without doing something. She wouldn't let Karen get away with it. The news spreads. It didn't take long for word of what happened to spread throughout the neighborhood. The park was a central point of the community, a place where people walked their dogs, played with their children, and gathered in the evenings for social events. What happened there that morning became the talk of the neighborhood within hours. Some neighbors expressed their shock and outrage at the treatment Maya had endured, while others, those who had always been reluctant to engage with her, either ignored the situation entirely or offered weak apologies. There were whispers about Karen, too. Some people seemed willing to turn a blind eye, chalking it up to an isolated incident, while others were disgusted by the way she had acted, and they were vocal about it. The biggest shock, however, came from Karen herself. Rather than offer an apology, she doubled down, claiming that Maya had been overreacting, that it had all been an accident. She even went so far as to say that Maya had been in the wrong for provoking her. It was the kind of response that only deepened the rift between her and the community. And to Maya, it confirmed everything she needed to know about Karen. She wasn't just a bully, she was a coward who would do anything to protect her image, even at the expense of others. In the days that followed, Maya began to plan her next steps. She would not let this be swept under the rug. Her strength, her courage, would become the catalyst for a larger fight, a fight for respect, for justice, and for the dignity of every person who had ever been pushed aside. Karen may have thought she could intimidate Maya into silence, but in reality, she had only ignited a fire. Maya didn't know how long this battle would last or where it would take her, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't backing down. And Karen would regret the day she crossed her. The immediate aftermath of the incident set the stage for what would come next: the public outcry, the pursuit of justice, and the internal struggle that Maya would face as she navigated the complex emotional terrain of her fight. Maya knew that this wasn't just a personal battle, it was a societal one, one that would force the community to examine its values and its treatment of those who were different. And she was ready to face it head on. The days following the incident felt like a whirlwind for Maya Angelou and her family. At first, Maya had been unsure of how to proceed. The humiliation was raw, the anger still fresh in her chest. She spent a lot of time in her room, processing everything that had happened. Her parents gave her space, but they also stayed close, offering support without forcing her to talk before she was ready. But as the days passed, Maya knew she couldn't let the incident slide. The injustice of it, the fact that someone had treated her like that in front of so many people, made her feel that this was bigger than herself. It wasn't just about her personal dignity anymore, it was about standing up for anyone who had ever been humiliated or mistreated because of their differences. With the emotional support of her parents, Maya began to plan. The first step was to document everything. She kept a journal of the incident, writing down everything she remembered, what Karen had said, how she had felt, and what had happened afterward. She also gathered statements from anyone who had witnessed the incident in the park. Several people had been there, and while some had remained silent, others had expressed their shock at Karen's actions. Maya wasn't sure if these witnesses would be enough to build a case, but she wasn't going to leave anything to chance. Her parents encouraged her to speak with a lawyer. It wasn't an easy decision for Maya. She had always been a private person, and confronting Karen in a legal setting felt like another invasion of her space. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was the only way to get Karen to face the consequences of her actions. If she didn't do it, if she allowed Karen to walk away without any accountability, Maya would never feel like she had truly won. So, with a heavy heart, Maya and her parents met with Samira Khan, a local civil rights lawyer who had helped several families in their community seek justice in cases of discrimination. Samira was a woman who had fought against inequality her entire career, and her reputation was impeccable. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and her unwavering belief in standing up for the rights of the marginalized. After listening to Maya's story, Samira didn't hesitate. "You've got a strong case here, Maya," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What happened to you was an assault, and we'll pursue it that way. No one should be allowed to treat another person like that, especially in front of witnesses. You deserve an apology, but more importantly, you deserve to see Karen face consequences for her actions." The decision was made. They would file a formal complaint with the police. Maya's mind raced with a mix of emotions, nervousness, fear, but also a growing sense of resolve. She had never wanted to be in the spotlight like this. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, but now she realized that this was the only way to ensure that people like Karen didn't get away with mistreating others. This wasn't just about her. It was about changing the way society viewed people with disabilities, the way people like Maya were treated in public spaces. Karen's reaction. Meanwhile, Karen was hardly fazed by the incident. She had expected it all to blow over. People would forget, or at least they would side with her. She had always been good at twisting the truth, manipulating situations to suit her narrative. But when Maya went public with the story and began legal proceedings, Karen was taken aback. It was one thing for Maya to be upset privately, but for her to go public, to challenge her, was another thing entirely. Karen wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she considered beneath her. Instead of feeling guilt or remorse, Karen went on the offensive. She quickly enlisted a lawyer, claiming that Maya had exaggerated the situation. According to Karen, Maya had been provoking her, causing her to lose control. She tried to twist the story, painting herself as the victim in the whole ordeal. She spread the narrative around the neighborhood, turning some of the more impressionable residents against Maya. The community was split. Some people sided with Maya, seeing her as the true victim of the incident. Others, especially those who had always been wary of people like her, people who were different, found themselves believing Karen's version of events. Karen's polished reputation, her social standing in the community, made it easier for people to side with her, to give her the benefit of the doubt. But Maya wasn't going to back down. The more Karen fought, the more Maya felt a fire within her, a fire she hadn't known was there. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been oppressed, for everyone who had ever been treated as less than human. This wasn't about getting an apology from Karen. It was about standing up for her own dignity and the dignity of everyone who had ever been treated with disrespect. The battle in court, The day of the court hearing arrived, and Maya felt a combination of nervousness and determination. She had never been inside a courtroom before, and the thought of facing Karen again made her stomach turn. But she couldn't back out now. She had come too far. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Maya sat at the plaintiff's table, her parents by her side, while Karen sat with her lawyer on the opposite side. Maya could see the smug look on Karen's face, as if she had already won, but Maya wasn't intimidated. She had come prepared, and she knew this was her moment to make a difference. The proceedings were long, and Karen's lawyer was relentless, trying to discredit Maya by focusing on her disability, questioning her reliability, and whether she could truly understand the situation. It was clear that Karen's team was trying to paint Maya as someone who was overreacting, someone whose word wasn't as valuable because of her disability. But Maya was ready. She spoke clearly and confidently, telling her story in her own words. She described the incident in the park, how she had been shoved from her wheelchair, and the emotional devastation she felt. She spoke about her years of fighting for respect, fighting for equality, and how this incident was just another example of how people like her were treated. As Maya finished her testimony, she felt a surge of pride. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't the girl in the wheelchair anymore. She was a fighter, a person who demanded respect and would stop at nothing to get it. The court would deliberate for hours, but Maya had already won. She had won the battle that mattered most, the battle for her own dignity, whether or not the court ruled in her favor. Maya knew she had already proven that no one, not even Karen, could silence her. The fight for justice had only just begun, but it had already changed Maya Angelou forever. She had found a new strength within herself, a new sense of purpose. And no matter the outcome, she knew this would not be the last battle she would fight. As Maya Angelou sat in the courtroom, the weight of the moment began to settle in. Her hands rested on the table in front of her, fingers slightly trembling from the intensity of what had been happening over the last few days. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to rise above the challenges life had thrown her way. But this battle felt different. This wasn't just about her disability. It was about the respect she had been denied, about the justice she deserved, and the silence she had fought against for so long. The judge had adjourned the hearing for lunch, and Maya took the opportunity to step outside for a few moments of fresh air. Her parents, who had been quietly supportive the entire time, accompanied her. The air felt crisp, the warmth of the day contrasting with the chill she felt inside. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and yet there was a fire burning within her, a fire she hadn't realized existed until this moment. Maya, her father said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You've done well today. You've shown more courage than most people could ever dream of. I'm proud of you, no matter what happens. Maya smiled faintly, but the pride in her father's words only intensified the knot in her stomach. This fight was far from over, and she couldn't let herself feel complacent. Karen wasn't the type to back down easily, and Maya knew that Karen's arrogance could very well be her biggest weapon. But something inside Maya had changed. She wasn't the victim anymore. She wasn't just the girl in the wheelchair. She was standing up for something far bigger than herself. She was standing up for everyone who had been made to feel less than human, for everyone who had been dismissed, humiliated, or ignored. She wasn't fighting for an apology. She was fighting for equality, for justice, and for the dignity of every person who had ever been treated as invisible. As Maya sat down outside, the crisp breeze touching her face, her mind raced with thoughts of the battle ahead. She thought about the community that had stood by and said nothing, the people who had been too afraid to speak out, the ones who had turned away. Karen was powerful, well-liked, and influential. But Maya had something Karen didn't, the unwavering conviction that what had happened to her was wrong. And now, that conviction had become her weapon, Karen's reaction. Meanwhile, Karen had retreated to her side of the courtroom with a sense of smug certainty. Despite the shock she had felt earlier when Maya went public, Karen believed she still had the upper hand. After all, she had always been in control of the narrative. In her mind, this was just another situation she could manipulate, another instance where her status and reputation would protect her. She was determined to make sure that Maya would never be taken seriously. She had already dismissed the claims of assault, trying to make it seem as though Maya had overreacted, exaggerating the entire situation. Karen had a carefully crafted defense in place. Maya was too sensitive, too emotional, and too fragile to handle confrontation. To Karen, this was just a minor altercation, a misunderstanding that didn't deserve to be taken seriously. But as the judge reconvened and the proceedings continued, Karen began to realize that things weren't going according to plan. The witnesses who had been present in the park had taken Maya's side, and more people in the courtroom had begun to whisper in support of Maya's actions. It was clear that the tide was turning. People were starting to see Karen for who she truly was, not the well-to-do, well-liked figure she had once portrayed, but a bully. When Karen took the stand to defend herself, she appeared confident, perhaps too confident. She tried to maintain her composure, but it was evident that her defense was crumbling. Under cross-examination, Karen's arrogance began to show through. Her tone, once polished and controlled, became defensive and condescending. Maya had not provoked her, and the idea that Karen could justify her actions by claiming Maya was too sensitive only made her look like a person who lacked empathy, someone who couldn't admit when they were wrong. As Karen finished her testimony, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Maya sat in her seat, her eyes locked onto Karen. There was no triumph in her gaze, no sense of victory. There was only a quiet resolve. She didn't need to prove anything to Karen. The evidence, the witnesses, and her own story were enough. Now, all she had to do was wait. The community's reaction. Back in the community, the atmosphere had changed. Word had spread quickly about the trial, and neighbors who had once ignored Maya or treated her with indifference were beginning to take notice. Some came forward in support, speaking out against Karen's behavior. Maya's strength, her willingness to stand up for herself, had inspired them to take a stand too. It was a turning point not just for Maya, but for the entire neighborhood. In private conversations, neighbors began to question why they had never spoken up before. Some admitted that they had been intimidated by Karen's reputation, too afraid to speak out or challenge her. But now, Maya's actions were making them realize that no one should be allowed to dominate others with impunity. The tide was turning, and it wasn't just about winning the case anymore. Maya was changing the narrative. She was showing people that they didn't have to be afraid, that they could stand up to the bullies and the powerful people who thought they were untouchable. As the judge called for the final recess, Maya couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This was her moment. The fight had been long and difficult, and it was far from over, but she had reached the turning point. She had done something that would resonate far beyond the courtroom. She had forced people to confront their biases, to see how easily a person could be dehumanized, and to recognize the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it felt uncomfortable. For the first time, Maya Angelou felt truly empowered. The fight wasn't over, but she was no longer the girl in the wheelchair. She was the one leading the charge, and she was going to make sure that Karen and anyone like her would never be allowed to treat people like this again. The final ruling came just days later, but by the time the court convened again, Maya Angelou had already won. Not in the way she might have imagined when she first filed the complaint, but in a far more meaningful way. The courtroom was quiet as the judge read out the verdict. There were no fireworks, no grand speeches. Instead, it was a quiet, matter-of-fact decision, delivered with the weight of an important moral stand. Karen was held responsible for the assault on Maya. The judge ordered her to issue a public apology and pay for Maya's medical and legal expenses. Though it wasn't the grand gesture that some might have hoped for, it was a victory that resonated deeply. The ruling was more than just a legal decision, it was a statement. Maya wasn't just the girl in the wheelchair anymore. She had become a symbol of resilience, of courage, and of fighting for one's rights in a world that often overlooks those who are different. Maya sat there, her parents by her side, as the judge finished. For a moment, she didn't feel the usual rush of triumph. Instead, she felt relief. Relief that she had been heard, that justice had been served. But it wasn't just about her, not anymore. It had never really been about her. This was bigger than any single person. This was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than human, about standing up against those who thought their power and privilege made them untouchable. When Karen was called to the stand to issue her apology, she looked noticeably uncomfortable. Maya couldn't help but notice the discomfort that had replaced her usual air of arrogance. There was no smugness, no sense of superiority. For the first time, Karen had been forced to acknowledge her wrongdoing, to publicly admit that she had wronged Maya. Her words were cold and insincere. But they didn't matter to Maya. It wasn't the apology that she had been fighting for, it was the recognition that Karen could no longer hide behind her privilege and mistreat others without consequences. As the court session ended, Maya stood up slowly, her legs a little shaky from the tension, but there was a lightness in her step. The courtroom had felt heavy, a space where people came to face the consequences of their actions. But for Maya, it was a space of transformation. The girl who had once felt humiliated, the girl who had been shoved out of her wheelchair in front of strangers, was now standing tall, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of herself. Maya's reflection. Later that evening, Maya sat on her porch, staring out into the quiet street. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Her wheelchair was parked beside her, and she found herself running her fingers along the cool metal of the wheels. It had always been a part of her, a constant companion in her journey through life. But now, she saw it differently, not as a symbol of her limitations, but as a symbol of her strength. Her parents had gone inside, giving her a few moments of peace. Maya was grateful for their support, their unwavering belief in her. They had stood by her through the hardest parts of the journey, and now they were there to celebrate her victory. But it wasn't just about the legal victory. It was about the way this experience had shaped her, had forced her to look deep within herself and find a new sense of strength and purpose. This fight, she realized, had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about Karen or the court or even the apology. It was about the way she now saw herself, the way she had reclaimed her own power. She wasn't the girl who had been humiliated and knocked down. She wasn't the girl who had allowed herself to be silent. Maya was the woman who had stood up for herself and for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than human. But as she sat there, a quiet sense of unease began to creep in. Karen had apologized, and the law had delivered justice. But Maya knew that this wasn't the end of the battle. There were still people out there, people like Karen, who believed that their power could shield them from accountability. But now, Maya was ready to take on whatever came next. She had the strength, the courage, and the resolve to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. This battle had sparked something in Maya, a fire that would not go out. She would never let anyone like Karen silence her again. And she would continue to speak out for those who had no voice, to stand up for those who were being pushed aside, until the world began to change. The fight for justice was not over, it had only just begun. A community transformed. Over time, the incident with Karen began to shift the dynamics of the community. While Karen had retreated into her circle of influence, the people who had witnessed the events were inspired by Maya's courage. Neighbors who had once been silent began to speak out when they saw injustice happening. Maya had shown them that they didn't have to turn away when something was wrong. They didn't have to stay silent when someone was being mistreated. People who had once thought of Maya as the disabled girl began to see her for who she truly was, a woman with strength, character, and a voice that could not be ignored. Her story spread beyond the neighborhood, reaching people who had faced similar challenges and had remained silent for too long. Maya's fight became a symbol not just for people with disabilities, but for anyone who had ever felt marginalized or excluded. In the end, Maya didn't just win a court case, she changed the way the world saw her and the way it saw people like her. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its final golden rays across the sky, Maya Angelou knew that her journey was far from over. There would be other battles to fight, other voices to amplify, but for now she could sit in peace, knowing that her courage had made a difference. She had not only claimed her dignity, she had given others the courage to do the same.